When people read a novel by John Steinbeck, they often notice how unique and memorable his style of writing is. He doesn't just simply tell a story to tell a story. He creates life, and he creates characters and circumstances that coincide with reality. Two people put it perfectly. Upton Sindar from Common Sense. Steinbeck is a poet. Everything is real, and everything is perfect. And then with T.C. Boyle. You can read about the lives of migrant workers in your textbook, but if you read it in Steinbeck's version, you get to live it and breathe it. So when I decided to add a chapter addition to The Grapes of Wrath, I knew that I had a little research to do. He isn't someone that you can just look at and be like, hey, I can copy this, and just go along and copy it. No, there's a lot of different literary devices and writing techniques you have to look at. And so that's what I did. Now, about my chapter. I titled this chapter 21 and a half to go between 21 and 20. And when I decided to write a chapter addition, I didn't want to mess with the plot line too much, because when authors write plots, they usually have stuff that happens for reasons. They have characters in place that are there for reasons. And so what I did instead was I looked for events that maybe were mentioned but not described, and I made them into a scene. And I found one when Jim Casey, there was a long period of time when he was absent because he was in prison. And when he comes back, he runs into Tom Joad, and he tells him about his time in prison. And so I took an event, and this is actually the event, so you can read along with me or just listen to me. Well, they was nice fellas, you see. What made them bad was they needed stuff. And I begin to see that. It's me that makes all the trouble. I ain't got it worked out. Well, one day, they gave us some beans that was sour. One fella started yelling, and nothing happened. He yelled his head off. Trusty came along and looked in and went on. Then another fella yelled. Well, sir, then we all got yelling. And we all got on the same tone, and I tell you, it just seemed like the tank bulged and gave and swelled up. By God, then something happened. They came a-running, and they gave us some other stuff to eat. Give it to us, you see? So I took that, and I made it into a long scene, and it's about 1,130 words. And it takes place in Bakersfield, California, because I got that from chapter 20, because that was when he was taken, and that was the county he was in. So that was the jail he was taken to. Okay, my analysis. The first element that I looked at was one of 4, and that was syntax. And if you notice on the slides, on the left side, the quotes are in red because they come from the novel, and on the right side, the quotes are in green because they come from my own chapter. So syntax, the first aspect, types of sentences during conversation. A lot of the times when the focus of the chapter was around Jim Casey, it was a lot of dialogue going on. And that was really significant for a lot of reasons, because it made it so that the dialogue was more important than what was going on, because he always had a lot to say, and I'll explain a little more about that as I go on. But the first thing that you will notice is whenever there was dialogue, outside of the dialogue, there was only kind of simple sentences, and usually things that described a character's action, something they would do. Like on page 20, it said, Job looked at him with drooped eyes, and then he laughed. And then it would be followed by long conversation and long dialogue that had a lot of complex and difficult sentences, like down here on page 266, where Casey said he got tough and hit him, and he started shooting, hit a woman down the line, so I hit him again. And you can see that's a little more complex than the previous one. And I mirrored that in my own writing with on line 61, I said the sheriff's cheeks twitched, but he did not respond. And then it would go into dialogue like on here. Look, when I were a preacher, I've been preaching about Christ and his disciples, which is a little more complex than the original sentence. So that was aspect number 1. Aspect number 2, speaking duration variation. As I mentioned before, there was a lot more dialogue when Jim Casey was around, and if you read it, you also noticed that when Jim Casey was speaking, his speech was more long-winded than other characters. He would speak for anywhere from 1 line to 6 lines to 10 lines, whereas the person who would be speaking with him would only speak maybe 1 or 2 lines, maybe 3 at most. And so I mirrored that over here, which this line, if you can see, is from 40 to 46. So that's 6 lines, which is actually a long-winded speech. So, yeah. And that's significant with him as a character because it really makes it focus on the kind of ideas he has, and it makes the readers really think about what he has to say instead of just who he is. The second element I looked at was diction. Now, diction was a huge thing in his writing. All over in the dialogue, you can see his unique style of diction and the way that he would give his characters accents, which really helped set the scene and the settings and the characters, and it made it more real, more raw than just, regular dialogue. So the first aspect I looked at was colloquial terms. and accents. For the colloquial terms, he used words like you fellas, and I did the same thing in my own writing, because instead of saying things like you guys or y'all or them people and stuff, and that helped stay with the colloquial terms. And there was also an example I didn't have on here where I put in my writing about someone wearing fancy knickers, which is something you wouldn't really wear a lot when you were, maybe in this time period. And then with the accents, he intentionally would cut off letters in dialogue to give his characters accents. Like whenever there were ing words, he would cut off the G and then put an apostrophe, and so that way it was fightin' instead of fighting. And he would do stuff with other words like and, it would be a-n apostrophe instead of just and, or he'll say old with o-l apostrophe instead of old. And so that was the things with the accents, and there's a lot of examples in that, and you can see them all throughout both my chapter and from the book. And the second aspect I looked at with diction was intentional grammatical errors. That was another thing he had a lot of whenever his characters were speaking. Outside of dialogue, he kept the kind of style of writing that you need when you're writing professional writing, and because it was narration. But inside of the dialogue, it was very different with the characters. And so, with the intentional grammatical errors, the first one that I looked at was double negatives. Like you can see in this one, it says, if it hits you wrong, don't take no offense, and don't know those are double negatives. And so I did something here where it says, we don't want no beans, so there's don't and no, and that's a double negative. And then the second one was tense jumping. In one sentence, he will say something in the past and then suddenly switch to the future, or he would do it the other way, or something in the present. But here it says, I've seen it was that way, instead of saying I saw it was that way. And so that's a tense jumping example right there. And then over here where I put, look, when I were a preacher, I've been preaching, instead of saying when I was a preacher, I preached. So that's how some of the intentional grammatical errors went. And then the last one was subject and verb disagreement, which is down here. It says, some of the fellows in the tank was drunks, instead of some fellows were drunks, which would have been the appropriate grammatical way of saying that. And then here it says, this beans is sour, instead of saying these beans are sour. And so that's how I mirrored that. The next two elements were characterization and biblical allusions. Jim Casey was a very significant character throughout this novel because he was portrayed kind of like a mentor to Tom Joad, but he also had this very Christ-like figure to him. And so I wanted to make sure that I kept that when I did my own writing. And so I made sure he kept his preacher persona where he talked all the time and was always talking and all that kind of stuff, where it almost seemed like he was preaching at them practically all the time, almost like he had sermons and stuff. And so this was really significant for his character because it made you really listen to what he had to say and not just, see what he's doing or what he's doing it with or whatnot. It's just all about his philosophical ideas. And this kind of helped the author himself get his own thoughts about, religion or whatnot through a character into this book. Okay, and then biblical allusions. Biblical allusions were definitely all over this novel. They were everywhere, from the Promised Land, which was portrayed as California, to Tom Joad and Jim Casey sometimes taking on the role of Jesus Christ. Like when Tom Joad went off and he's like, I'm going to become part of the world. It was almost like he was sacrificing himself. And he had a last dinner with his mom, which almost could be seen as the Last Supper. And so those were kind of biblical allusions. So when I wrote my chapter, I wanted to make sure that I had some of those. And I didn't want to make them too obvious or too much, because he had a really cool way of, just incorporating them in there to where if you didn't pay attention, you would miss it. And so if you look at the beginning of my chapter, which is in front of you, it talks about how there are 12 inmates. And I made that significant because in the Bible there were 12 disciples. And originally I didn't know if I wanted to do 12 disciples instead of, 13, because, Jim Casey was portrayed as kind of a Christ-like figure, so it would have been him and then the 12 disciples. But I decided, since while he was in jail, he was still doing a lot of thinking, that he was still developing into that role as Jesus Christ. And so I put him with the 12 disciples. And then there's there's a person in there who's I introduced him to the plot line and introduced him as a new character, and his name is Iscariot, or Iscariot, whichever way you want to pronounce it. And that name is significant because in the Bible there was Judas, and Judas had the last name of Iscariot, or it was the name that was given to him as his second name. And so I used that instead of just saying Judas, for those who don't know that Iscariot is Judas' last name, you may not catch up on it. And so with that, it's funny because in the chapter itself, he is also portrayed as a thief, which is who Iscariot was before the disciple. He was also the betrayer, which kind of could do some overshadowing for that. So those were the four elements: syntax, diction, characterization, and biblical allusions. And so with that said, there was a lot of stuff that went behind writing in the style of John Steinbeck, and there were much more aspects I could have spoke about, but these four kind of stuck out to me the most. And so